So today we're focusing on international responses to the kind of challenges that the subject matter of the previous two parts of the class have created for societies and individuals. The kinds of complex emergencies, domestic and international conflicts, natural disasters, population movement, environmental degradation, all of these existing as well as emerging challenges to us as individuals, as states, in the international community have been responded to in a number of different ways that we've touched on over the course of the semester. But for today, what I really wanted to focus on was the kind of larger international responses to a lot of these different efforts. And I know in a lot of your papers you're focusing on specific multilateral agreements, international organizations like the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the United Nations International Organization for Migration, or other international organizations. But what I wanted to try to touch on are the types and a typology for kind of understanding international responses to these kind of conflicts. And so for today, as in previous weeks, start by defining the terms I'm going to be talking about, the areas in which there has been cooperation related to the subject matter of this class, as well as the ways that some of these challenges are larger or complex than other challenges they faced in the past. Then move on to an example of international water resource cooperation, a topic that I know a lot of you are focused on for your essays. And then another different area that I don't think any of you are actually writing on, but I think is one that's salient for relations amongst a lot of powerful states in the Northern Hemisphere, in the climate change, opening up an area for exploration for natural resources in the Arctic, as well as potential military, as well as traditionally indigenous populations facing unprecedented challenges. And then draw some brief conclusions related to these international responses, and then broader conclusions that kind of tie in a lot of the material that we've covered so far in this class. So let's start by briefly defining some of our terms and why we should care. And I think when a lot of you might have started this class, when you think about environmental change or climate change in general, you're likely to think about the multilateral UN efforts that the IPCC, basically, that you've heard about the reports, that they're saying that things are bad and that things need to change in order to keep the temperatures warming to be less than 2 degrees Celsius. What I've tried to do is to bring in get you to read a specific part, one of the reports, see the strengths and weaknesses in those reports, and then have you read the Gleditsch and Norda's piece that really gets into this minutia and why it can have an effect on how they reach their conclusions, the generalizability of their conclusions, and how some of the conclusions might have less support than others. So the IPCC report, the one that I had you read this week, it received a lot of attention in the international media. You probably read a little bit about it before, but I think as a way to kind of briefly introduce it, there are a couple of graphs that got a lot of headlines that really showed the dramatic change that the international environment is going through in the last couple of years. And these graphs really just kind of make it visceral. Is the extent of the change. You can see in the top left, surface temperatures have increased, sea ice has decreased, and sea levels have increased, which has a direct effect and ties into what we saw earlier this semester in the areas in Australia that would be affected by sea level change, as well as in the US that I already touched on. And moving on, the CO2 emissions that have been a subject of a lot of attention, and greenhouse gas increases over the last 50 or 60 years really provide strong evidence for the kind of scale of change that the international system is really going through. So, given these changes, there are a number of different domestic international responses. We've touched on some of them in this class last week specifically, but also in other classes. Some states have done more than others. Some are facing different kinds of threats and different kinds of changes. And last week we focused on the domestic responses, international militaries, the U.S. that has been quite specific in recognizing the threats and developing ways of trying to adapt to them, and the Australian military starting to make these kinds of studies. But as you can see with that color-coded graph, they're not as necessarily far along as other militaries, but the ones that focus on national security and being able to project force and to be able to provide for citizen security often have to be thinking about the practicalities of what they're doing and what kind of threats are going to be facing them going forward. This week we kind of look at international efforts at trying to coordinate these domestic responses, although in a world in which you have an anarchic international system and national sovereignty ultimately rests with the states. The international arena is when there can be more discussion, more areas for conflict, as well as more areas for inaction. A couple of brief summaries for what we've already seen last week with the domestic responses, that climate change and environmental scarcity has an interactive effect on the most vulnerable people within societies, as well as the ability of states to actually respond to these pressures. This interactive effect has been a recurring theme over the course of the semester, that you do have these structural changes and that can create scarcity or difficult living conditions that interacts with people's existing lives and states' ability to be able to respond to those pressures. Mitigation and adaptation are the two terms we talked about last week as a way to deal with these kind of pressures. Mitigation efforts are those that reduce or prevent an undesirable outcome from happening, and that would be to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or to be able to limit the creation of greenhouse gases or other elements in society that would make these kind of changes worse. Adaptation is basically instead of trying to prevent something from happening, is dealing with things that have already happened, or be able to adapt to what's likely to happen in the future. It refers to changes in processes, practices, structures to moderate the potential damages or to benefit from opportunities associated with climate change. So adaptation we've seen so far with the floating gardens in Bangladesh. Opportunities could be related to the wine growing regions in Canada for new economic production, given the different climate change conditions. There's a lot of different ways you can think about adaptation. Mitigation is trying to prevent it from happening. Adaptation is basically adapting to the system and to the changes that are coming along the track. And when you try to make any of these domestic or international policies, there's an estimation of what is the likelihood or risk of these things actually happening, and the potential impact of it. So risk is a function of that impact of an event and the likelihood that it actually happens. And the difficulty with calculating risk is that us as humans, we have mixed ability to understand the hidden risks are the ones we kind of take for granted on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to those like terrorism that is highly unlikely but is very visceral, and that there is a relative risk for different policy outcomes, and there needs to be some kind of estimation about what the realistic impact is. And of course different peoples have different levels of vulnerability to these kind of changes. As we've seen over the course of the semester, those that are less countries that are less developed or have less of a buffer or resources to be able to deal with the kind of changes that come down the track, they have a more limited capacity to be able to adapt, so they're more vulnerable to those kind of changes that we've seen over the course of the semester. The international responses that I'm going to be talking about today go from what I would argue as those that are less difficult in being able to coordinate to those that are the most difficult. Start by going it alone with domestic mitigation and adaptation, states focusing on their own domestic challenges without trying to reach out to the other international actors, because you don't need to reach any kind of agreement or have a negotiation with international actors. Next up would be bilateral agreements, one state with another state. Some of you are writing about water issues. We're going to look at those in a second. Bilateral treaties, two countries who share a border or a basin. It's more difficult than a state deciding to do what they want to do on their own. But there are two actors. They're likely to have some history in interacting with each other. And so cooperation is possible. More difficult are multilateral treaties, the larger efforts at trying to deal with change. As you have a larger number of actors, you have more veto players, more interest that needs to be taken into account, and that can make substantial cooperation more difficult. International organizations or regimes, we're going to see a couple later on today, but they are it's a much more laborious and long-term practice in order to try to reach agreements to create international organization or a set of organizations and practices that would fall under what we cover in political science as a regime related to a specific issue area. And at the very top is just norms, patterns of behavior, options that states consider legitimate or illegitimate, as we've seen with what's legal in going to war, changing norms about what is okay to either necessary to provide for citizens for human rights or human security or environmental protection. Those kind of norms about what states can do within their countries and what's in their interest to do with other countries are arguably the most difficult. And we're going to touch on different examples of all of these different five areas of responses to environmental change today. There are a lot of challenges, of course, to international cooperation. I'm sure you've seen in other classes for those of you who have taken political science. The first and the most relevant today is the tragedy of the common, that in an anarchic system in which you don't have sovereignty above the state, the ability to enforce rules. Actors have incentive to try to take advantage of common resources without spending the costs in order to make sure these are environmentally sustainable. Fisheries would be an example of this, that fish cross international boundaries in the open oceans, and countries have incentives to try to take as much as they can while worry about the costs of that over the long term, or just ignoring or not fully understanding them. When you do have international cooperation, the number of actors is often larger than with domestic politics. Larger number of veto players that could prevent cooperation from actually happening. Over the time span that we've looked at in this class, the last 100 years, there's been substantial changes in the distribution of power in the international system between a multipolar world to a bipolar world to arguably a unipolar world, but now with the U.S. Economic and political influence declining, this change in power and capability in international politics and in trade has an effect on whether current systems that have worked for cooperation in the past are continuing to be used, as well as how more powerful actors might want their perspective and their interests taken into account in international agreements that have already been reached. Politics is a two-level game, as if those of you who have taken IR theory would have seen before, and so there are substantial domestic incentives to either avoid agreements or to be able to avoid mechanisms to enforce international agreements in domestic law. And so there are a number of cases in which you've seen tentative agreements reached in the international realm, but then domestic politics keeping them from actually being able to be implemented, related to climate change and greenhouse gases. 1994 Kyoto Protocol is an example in which there was an effort to try to limit greenhouse gas emissions. The enforcement capabilities weren't there, and domestic incentives for actually following through weren't there, and there's a lot of cheating or ignoring the agreement that had been reached. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Export Countries, is an organization purely built around trying to regulate the amount of petroleum being brought to the international market in order to try to lead to price consistency. And there's been a lot of research that's been done to look at the failures of that, given the widespread price volatility over the last 20 or 30 years, as well as the current decrease in price over the last couple years due to Saudi Arabia and other countries pumping more than they said that they would do in the past. Related to a couple of the topics that we've touched on in this class, the International Criminal Court, recently created as an effort to try to prevent or to enforce international norms related to war crimes, genocide. A number of countries have threatened to or have actually withdrawn from the International Criminal Court. South Africa tried to withdraw, but their Supreme Court ended up saying that it wasn't legal under a South African domestic law, so that ended up not happening. So there's a lot of challenges related to the fact that there are more actors that needed to be able to have their interests taken into account, and the possibilities for cheating are greater, and domestic incentives that can work counter to the broader interests or long-term interests. And I think when we think about large multilateral efforts to try to deal with environmental issues, one of the largest is that trying to tackle climate change. And so I think for the readings for today, as well as one of the topics, the IPCC is a multilateral effort that faces a lot of these challenges while trying to understand political challenges and trying to make change, but then also trying to understand the challenges that are facing humanity given the impact that humanity is having on the planet. So let's start talking about that.